Welcome to our webinar. We are so grateful to have you here with us today. I'm Angela Brintlinger. I'm the director of the Center for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and more importantly, I am the chair of the Department of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian. What am I doing? Too many things. I'll start over. Anyway, welcome. I'm Angela Brittlinger from Ohio State. Many of you may know me. Some of you, I think, are our alumni, and some of you, I think, are alumni of Professor Collins's vampire class that he's been teaching here at Ohio State for just over 25 years. Dr. Collins has his PhD from UCLA in Slavic linguistics, and he is an expert in many of the languages of the Slavic lands and also in folklore. He's been teaching with me now for almost 3 decades here at Ohio State, and I know he's had several thousand students go through his classroom over the years. This is an appropriate moment, appropriate time of year to be talking about Slavic folklore. And we're really grateful to Daniel for joining us this afternoon and sharing his expertise. You saw the instructions that went by a moment ago. I will be running the Q&A, so feel free, as when questions occur to you, to pop them into the Q&A. I'll be monitoring that, and I will kind of add questions together. If you ask the same thing as someone else, don't be embarrassed. It'll be delightful to have a conversation afterwards. But I'm going to hand the mic, so to speak, over to my dear friend Daniel for his expertise this afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Angela. I will just find my presentation, which I was running through a second ago. But welcome again, and I'm very glad to have you here today, and I hope it will be of interest to you. I have been, as Angela said, teaching on the subject of vampires for many years, and indeed I was a student in a vampire class at University of Virginia, where I got interested in it for the first time. My teacher was a folklorist that specialized in vampires, Jan Perkowski. Some of you may be familiar with his books. My own book, The Envious Dead, is in progress. And today I want to talk about things that go bump in the Slavic night, and that's primarily going to be about vampires, but I'm going to try to fit them into a more general context. One of the things I do when I teach the class is to show how the monsters that are created by a culture, whatever it might be, fit into larger patterns. They are the answer to larger questions, and they're inspired by the problems that societies face. And so I always want to treat things, even if they seem absurd, beliefs that may seem absurd, with the due respect, because the people that had the beliefs needed them, and they actually were very practical in solving problems that are universal. So the title, Things That Go Bump in the Slavic Night, if I should just explain, I'm primarily talking about the Slavic countries of Eastern Europe. And I do also study Albanian and Romanian and Hungarian, to a lesser degree, folklore, and talk about them in my class. Those are not countries with Slavic languages, but due to long coexistence, they have many shared beliefs. Some of the Slavic beliefs originate in those countries, and others, the Slavs have exported to those countries over the years. So there's been a lot of interaction. So things that go bump in the night. You may know it as the title of a young adult book series, and you may know it as the so-called Cornish litany from Cornwall in England, from ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties and things that go bump in the night. Good Lord, deliver us. This is a prayer that supposedly was recorded in 1500. Now, there are Slavic equivalents plenty for this. This is from a manuscript from the 18th century that's contained in the Bulgarian National Library in Sofia. And it's actually a very beautiful manuscript. The last several pages have prayers that should not have been included in the prayer book. and they're not written as beautifully as the rest of the manuscript. And one of these is the prayer. It's called Prayer Against Vampires, and it says it is a prayer, in fact, to the Virgin Mary, or the Mother of God in Orthodox terminology. Most pure Lady, Mother of God, drive off the echidna serpent, a magical being, the Mora, about whom I'll talk about, the witch, the vampire, and every evil thing from God's servant, Danielo. Insert your name here. So vampire beliefs were exactly that, and they certainly were robust in the 18th century, but they still exist. Even very traditional ones have a way of rising out of the grave from time to time. The basic issue for the Slavic world is really not fear of the dead and fear of supernatural beings, because the entire world, including your home, is full of these supernatural beings. In fact, it's difficult to call them supernatural. It's really natural. The rugged landscape in which they lived, they really did not view as their own. There were masters, lords and ladies of the land, and I'm not talking about the actual human landlords so much as beings that would have in pagan times been called gods, that controlled or ruled the natural spaces. So the shepherd tending his flock in the mountains, or shepherdess, the hunter that goes into the forest, the fisherman who goes onto the waters, or the woman that goes to do her laundry in the lake, all of these people in traditional folklore would be aware of the fact that they were sharing the space with someone that they probably could not see and did not want to see. And so you have to learn the attitude of coexisting successfully so that you don't bring wrath of these beings upon you. So this is a picture of a Hutsal shepherd in the Carpathian Mountains of Western Ukraine. His ethnic group is Hutsal. They're Highlanders. And in a beautiful book by Vincent called On the High Uplands that talks about their folk beliefs, it said, in lowland communities, those in the valleys, the inhabitants have developed a sense that they are secure and in control, as if a mighty dam had been built to hold back the powers, what we would call supernatural beings. Waves may beat against the dam, but they come from storms raging somewhere far from the human world. The Hutsal Highlanders have no such defenses or sense of security. They constantly see, as it were, dark waves flowing in from the infinite. Entire troops, entire legions of supernatural beings. Whether threatening or friendly, these beings are always powerful and mysterious. Now, Vincennes distinguishes the valleys from the highlands, but if you go back in time, these were general beliefs everywhere, that there are simply is a spiritual world, an unseen mystical world that you have to coexist with. So every place had its spirit. The hunter in the forest learns to be respectful to if he knows what is good, or the young woman who's gone to gather mushrooms or berries. They know what's good for them. They have to know the rules and the customs of how to coexist with these spiritual beings. In the Balkans, the beautiful vilas or samovilas or samadivas may dance in rings, fairy rings in remote places. Generally, you do not want to see them, but you should know how to deal with them. And their existence is not a problem of metaphysics for you. You know that they are there. It's a fact that you've grown up with. Now, one of these facts is that your home is, I wouldn't call it haunted because these aren't ghosts, but there is a spirit who represents, at least, and maybe an ancestor in the home. And this is a traditional belief. And again, not everyone has it today. Most people probably don't, but there's a sort of nostalgia for it. This is a 2021 website from a Serbian news service, Republika, and it talks about the house snake or the guardian snake, because in the Balkans, the snake is the form that's taken by the house spirit, and you generally don't see it, but you might hear it go bump in the night. It is something that you want to have in your house, and if you drive it out, if you offend it, if you kill it, then it's going to bring disaster to your family. I particularly like in this website the fact that you can see the very traditional belief, along with obvious symbols of our contemporary technology. Right, that machine that the lab worker is working with, the Google Play, an app store, and the links, the web links. In other parts of the Slavic world, it's not a snake, by the way, but generally it's a hairy old man that may look like the head of the house in a certain sense as well. But they're there, they knock in the night, they make creaking noises in the night, and you don't want to see them, but if they're not there, then your family is missing something. Now, these are the permanent, you could say, owners, and so the humans are guests of their domains. Now, there also are invasive supernatural beings that the general technical term for this we would call powers of evil. In English is unclean power or filthy power. And this folk painting by Franjo Klopotan from Croatia called Unquiet Evening probably illustrates simply a devil or some kind of seasonal demon that comes in the winter time. But these as well are much more problematic than the house spirits because they're unpredictable. They're actually you can coexist with the place spirits, but these spirits will aggressively seek out humans to try to harm them. Now, the villas and the forest spirit will harm humans if they're disrespectful, if they trespass in different ways, but these are aggressors. They can be very beautiful, like the shooting star who sparkles gold. Before Stephanie Myers thought of Edward Cullen's sparkling gold, the Slavic shooting star or flyer came down and essentially wanted to seduce lonely women who didn't have prospects for marriage otherwise. Less pleasantly, you have the Balkan Karakanjo as a demon that comes out around Christmas and plays nasty tricks, especially if you're wandering the road drunk, by the way. But there are demons that have more religious significance. They fit into the worldview not only of peasant folklore, but also of the church. The church teachings were a sort of superstructure. They were something that the peasants learned along with and after probably what they learned from their grandmothers. So the grandmother's teachings actually went deeper among the old peasants in the 19th century and before. But you have demons and devils that are direct servants of Satan who are tempting people to sin. In this fresco from Rila Monastery in Bulgaria, which was painted in the 19th century, and it's periodically repainted. That's why it has its bright colors now. The inside of the church has the saints, the outside has the demons. And so we find in this picture that it's the village witch or healing woman. The monk that painted it thinks that she's a witch, and the sick are being brought to her. You can see a mother has brought her child who's kneeling before the woman. The demons are leading the people to commit the sin of going to the witch for help. And you can see that the monk is depicting the potion that the witch is giving him as actually excrement from one of the devils. So this kind of person, this human that crossed the line between the human world and the spirit world, the witch, the sorcerer, is one of the problematic people that will become vampires after death, according to folk belief. They're traitors in the gates, humans that violate the social order. That's by no means the only type, but everyone in folk belief should have an assigned place in the social world at every stage in life. You should know where you belong. You should know what your status is. It changes through life as you pass from babyhood to childhood to young adulthood, get married, have family, and become old and pass away. At each stage, there are adjustments, and in each stage, your relations to those around you change and have to be redefined. So if you're working in an agricultural society that doesn't like a lot of unpredictability because it hinders the labor that you need to survive, it's good to have places defined. And the way that this happens is through rituals and rites of passage. So the anthropologist William Howells wrote of human society in general, ritual with its book of directions, myth, works like a sheepdog to keep society from wandering aimlessly and disjointedly. In other words, you have to go through the rituals in order to get to your new place. That's the way that society has of defining the change. But there are problems like the witch and the sorcerer that cross the line between the human world and the spiritual demonic world. There are those that cannot find their place in the social order in life. And if so, they cannot find it in death. And this is another category of people that will become vampires. I've mentioned witches and sorcerers up to now, and lots of villages have them. But the first portal of life, the first kind of change is entering the physical world. And what you find in Slavic folklore is that there are lots of destructive, lost beings. You can call them restless dead as a general category. The vampire is the most prominent of the restless dead, but the vila or the little lost ones, the poterchata that are Ukraine, are essentially, these are children that don't come to term or are stillborn or miscarried, or that they don't get baptized. And so baptism is the signal of you're entering the social world. So those that died, of which there were very many, of course, the percentage of infant mortality was something like 25% in the 19th century in the first 28 days. Those that don't make it into the human world, they don't belong anywhere as dead. They don't get buried in the church cemetery. They don't have the rituals that would settle their soul. And so they can't belong to the human world. And so in addition to the actual forest spirits that are the old gods, essentially, we also have these former humans that will haunt non-human places, in the forest, in the mountains, in the water, in the case of the well-beloved Czech waterman, who is a boy that doesn't get baptized, and he drowns people and keeps their souls in watery jars. Think about that as a sort of temporary womb with amniotic fluid in it. Or the Navi that belong to the air, right, of the forest, the waterman, the water, and the air. These are children that don't come to term, and they return to the only world that they know. They don't fit into the human world, so when they return, basically they are attacking pregnant women and newborn babies. And this goes for the extremely terrifying Boroniec of Polish folklore, whose name is Miscarried, the miscarried one, right? And who precisely will attack women who are giving birth and kill them or kill their offspring. So these are souls of humans that can never enter the world. They can't be settled. Now, there are other kinds of demonic humans that might live into a ripe old age in Slavic folklore. And in fact, they marry, they have normal lives, but they have demonic propensities, which people don't necessarily know about. The Mora is the soul of a living young woman, unmarried, who either was not christened or whose parents had sex and conceived her on a day when they weren't supposed to be having sex because they were supposed to fast. And so this is a soul that cannot find rest. And she does something that she finds distressing herself in folklore. She goes and presses on sleepers in the night until they are smothered. Now, I have this experience all the time. It's called the clinical nightmare with sleep paralysis. And it's a terrifying experience, even when you know what it is. But the folk have a monster for it, the Mora. The name Mora, by the way, is the same as the mare in English nightmare. That has nothing to do with horses. It's the female demon, Mara. It's the same root, in fact, ultimately, as mortal, morbid, and murder. It means death, right? This famous painting of the nightmare depicting it as a little male imp. It was in Slavic folklore, a female demon. And the artist can't get out of his mind the fact that it must be connected with horses in some way, hence the demonic mare there. Now, that was birth and baptism, but there are other transitions in life. People that don't marry generally aren't, everyone was supposed to marry. And so the idea there is then they will not be settled in life. They don't have full adult social status in peasant world in the 19th century. And so they're going to be restless after death as well. And the most beautiful of these, beloved by poets, is the water nymph, or Rusalka in the East Slavic languages, who essentially hangs around sitting in trees on riverbanks or in the water with her long, beautiful golden or green or red hair, combing it quite a bit and drowning young men that come there. She's trying to find a husband, it seems. She's trying to settle herself by finding herself a mate. But because she doesn't belong in the human world, she can only bring destruction when she meets a human. The portal of death is where most of the beings that are actually called vampires happen. And of course, I have to emphasize about the vampire as a folkloric idea. It's very varied. I talk about Slavic folkloric vampires, and the plural is really true. There's a lot of variation. So I'm generalizing for a huge region over many decades or centuries. This is a funeral from a painting in the 1882, and this was the rite that had to be completed properly in order to send the soul of the dead person to a journey that would take them to the world of the dead, which could be heaven or hell, or it could simply be a parallel world where the dead lived. But one of the things that you can note, we have a lot of discussion of people grieving too much in American society, and people saying that they shouldn't grieve and so forth too much. The essential issue is your ties with the dead, or the dead's ties with the living, are not easy to break psychologically, but in a mythological sense, you're tied. If you were married to the dead, if you were the child of the dead and lived in the household with the dead, or a parent of a dead child, or the fiance of someone, you had social ties. And every time there's one of these rites, these rituals that change your social status, you have to redefine all of your relationships with those around you. And so the dead that can't really go from the world of the living to the world of the dead successfully are our vampires. The soul comes into the body at birth. It's been in the mother's amniotic fluid before birth, and then it inhabits the body in life and then leaves at the moment of death. But there's a lot of opportunity for the soul to re-enter the body, making the body a vampire, because the soul doesn't actually leave the premises. It stays in the house with the dead body until the dead body is taken out and dirt is thrown on the coffin by the priest. That's when the journey of the soul begins. So we've got this transition from the soul in the world of the living to rather a lengthy transition as people are dying and making preparations. They're supposed to have the last rites and then go on a journey to be incorporated into the world of the dead. If anything goes wrong in that transitional zone, any problem that occurs, the dead soul will re-enter its body in an inversion of its old state. It will return destructively, and it will return quite literally. It can't break its ties with its family and village. So this is our vampire, and the word vampire comes from the Slavic languages. This is a map. There are lots of variations of it showing its distribution. Linguists haven't figured out what it actually comes from. It's not a transparent word. I do have my own explanation, but it hasn't gone to press yet. But they use lots of other terms, like from the Latin word strix, striga, meaning witch or sorcerer, or wolf pelt, that's the word for werewolf, or heretic and sorcerer, or mora, that's the being that presses on you in the night, or the shadow, because they're often seen in that form, or in southwestern or southeastern Bulgaria, where you've got a lot of contact with Turkish culture, the genie, the jinn, and in a large part of the world, there's something called demons. They're dead bodies, but they're demons, and the double-souled will fall into this category in the Carpathian Mountains. Someone sent a question about the Carpathians, and so I've mentioned one of the things that's interesting about that area in southeastern Poland, in eastern Slovakia, and in far western Ukraine in particular, is that they have the idea that everyone has, or at least some people, have two souls. In some regions, it's everybody. In other regions, it is only demonic humans. But in any case, the problem is this: the priest baptizes the soul, but there are two of them. So the unbaptized soul is making this person schizoid, and essentially they do evil in life and become vampires in death. Now, the Slavs, Angela, I can't actually see a clock. What time is it?
We're doing fine. We're at 4:30.
All right. I have just a few more things to say then. We have lots of evidence that the Slavic peoples reacted to fear of the returning dead. In the last decade, there have been any number of archaeological finds. You can see that this vampire, so-called deviant burial from the 1300s, has a large metal object through the rib cage. Is Polish woman from about 1700 was buried with a scythe over her neck, so that if she tried to rise from her grave, she would be decapitated. Speaking of decapitation, it was the popular way of killing vampires in that area of Poland. Here's a case where the head is between the legs. It was not buried that way. They obviously thought it was a vampire and dug up the corpse and disheveled the remains in different ways. So they took these drastic measures, and gosh, they're gorgeous, and they dress so well, right? These are our vampires in American popular culture. We have Edward Cullen of Twilight fame and the phenomena that has died down a bit now, but in the last decade of the Fanpire, this Fanpire website, she signs herself Mrs. Cullen, right? She wants to be Edward Cullen's spouse, or he or she. Who wouldn't want a Cullen boy or girl as their boyfriend or girlfriend? I do want to point out they're dead. With that said, here's a page just for the whole Cullen family. Yes, but you can see the fantasies. The vampire is beautiful. It's someone that you want to have contact with. This is entirely different from what a Slavic peasant who believed natively in vampires would have thought. The great Serbian folklorist Vuk Karadžić, who truly has one of history's best mustaches, says the villagers will gather a hawthorn stake, then dig up the coffin. If they find the corpse undecayed, they pierce it with the stake, has to be hawthorn in that region, throw it on a pyre and cremate it. They say that when they find such a vukodlak, That's a word for vampire. It's actually a wolf pelt. It comes from the word for werewolf. In its grave, it has grown fat and reddened with human blood. Hence, there's a saying, red as a vampire. So what we have essentially in the Slavic folklore is not the glittery gold demigod of Twilight, but something much more like the native vampire Sava Savanovic of Serbian legend, who is or has been the spokes vampire for the local Valjevo beer. And you can see he's an ugly old man, red in the face, and I suppose from drinking too much Valjevo beer instead of blood, he's plumped out. Often you didn't see the vampire. Usually you didn't. It was when you dug them up in the graves that they were red. So they would be shadowy or invisible, or they could be in the Balkans, a boneless so-called belly of blood. They could leave their bones in the grave and squeeze out through holes and walk around, and they look like bagpipes often. They're essentially human skins that in some regions it's the soul has inflated, in others a devil has stripped the skin off a sinner and inflates it and walks around in that fashion at night, drinking blood. If you pop one of these, by the way, if you stick a knife in it, or if you're ready with thorns, wild rose, or any other spiky thing protecting your house, then they'll collapse into what can be described as tar or black jelly, right? Old clotted blood, essentially. Now, we think about our vampires, and one of the first things is the plastic teeth that you can buy for Halloween costume. So often my students have been a little bit surprised that fangs are not described very much in folk tales about vampires. In some cases, the vampire has lots and lots of teeth, not just fangs. And as this Serbian movie, Yugoslav movie from 1973 shows, they can also be very hairy. Or they can be described as iron-toothed. Their teeth are as strong as iron, and they can chew through anything. They can chew through the lock. They can chew through the door to get you. You run from the vampire in the folktale and try to hide in a closet, and the vampire chews through the closet. I always think about this like the movie The Shining, where the insane man is chopping Jack Nicholson is chopping down the door and says, "Here's Johnny." It's like that with the iron teeth chewing through the door. People expect vampires to take the form of bats, thanks to the novel Dracula and subsequent popular culture. And this is not part of Slavic folklore. And it couldn't be, because the vampire bat comes from Latin America, and it was named after Slavic vampires, not vice versa. There are perfectly respectable European bats, like Natterer's bat, but they eat insects, so they're not suspected. Now, anything that flies, in principle, could be a form that a vampire takes. Any animal could, because there's a belief that something that passes over the body of the vampire before it's buried will be a form that the vampire can take. Usually, though, you don't suspect bats. You suspect the moths that can come into your house much more easily. But the vampire can take the form of a wolf. And in fact, you'd say that's like a werewolf. Well, a werewolf and a vampire are the same thing in Slavic folklore. A werewolf is simply alive. It's a person that can turn into a wolf alive. The werewolf, when it dies, becomes a vampire. Usually you become you turn yourself into a wolf as a werewolf because you're a sorcerer, and it's easier to make raids if you're not observed if you're a wolf. But the difference is dead versus alive. A sorcerer becomes a vampire. A sorcerer can become a werewolf in life, and the werewolf becomes a vampire after death. So actually you find the term werewolf quite freely used in the Balkans to describe vampires. And then there's the cat. The cat that goes where it should not go. You're supposed to always watch the dead body when it's in the house before the funeral, because cats will jump over it or on it, because cats will always go where they're not supposed to go. And so the vampire might appear in the form of a cat, or or any sort of animal. You must guard the body so that nothing passes over it. I can come back to this if anyone's interested. Who will become a vampire? You see that an unguarded corpse is a vampire through no fault of their own. It's not because of the way the person lived. It's because their relatives are careless. In fact, there are all kinds of ways of becoming a vampire due to ritual incompleteness. You don't go through the ritual that you needed to complete yourself in traveling to the world of the dead. Truly, however, evildoers like sorcerers and witches do become vampires in Slavic folklore. In the village of Kadinosello in North Macedonia, an informant said, "As for vampires here in my village, I remember when I was little, a certain man from our village, the kind as the old people say, with an unclean soul, unbaptized, depraved, a robber and a cheat, was buried in the church. But after he was buried, he turned into a vampire and walked around like a man. He appeared around the village, and often they would say that that man passed by there. I saw him myself," right? And then it turns out, of course, that sinners, yes, do become vampires. The vampire, you think, well, vampires in our popular culture go after attractive young people because, of course, the monster will stalk what society regards as most valuable and vulnerable, youth and beauty. But the vampire in Slavic folklore is a family member that cannot leave. And so they say that the vampire hunts its own kindred. So certainly this is a lovely Slovak mother in 1939, and her baby is also beautiful. Of the two of them, the vampire is going to prefer the baby. Vampires are widely blamed for infant mortality and for killing livestock. So actually in this 2015 picture, this poor farmer has had lost several of his cows, probably due to what's called blackleg, a cattle disease, but it's not usually visible, unexpectedly, and operates very quickly. And then interesting is the Bulgarian word ustrel is a technical term for veterinarians now, but it is simply the term for a cattle killing vampire in that region. So you can imagine the poor farmer, that cow, one cow, two cows, is a devastating loss. The sheep are a devastating loss. Now, people that, as I mentioned, are incomplete, that don't go through the rituals that complete them in life, become vampires. It's not just evil doing. So if you die unbaptized, going through life, but somehow missing baptism, you'll become a vampire. Or if you die unmarried, or if you die last rites by accident, by drowning, by throwing yourself in the middle stream because you're unhappy, by hanging yourself, by being murdered, all of these things mean you died without the last rites. Your soul cannot go on. And then you have born vampires. And this, again, is mysterious to our way of thinking, which connects vampirism with adults who are attractive or with greatly evil people like Dracula. The born misfit is a person that is marked from the beginning of life as not fitting in. So if you're born in the caul, the amniotic, with the amniotic sac intact, if you're born with teeth, if you're born with a tail, all of these medical indicators signal that you have a special destiny in life, that you are in some way supernatural or demonic in potential, and that you're going to be a vampire afterwards. So I have a story to tell, and then we'll end here. This was told by a Macedonian woman in 1994, and the events probably took place around the year 1952. When I was young, my husband was a soldier. I had a little girl. Once I had a woolen blanket and a woman snatched it from me. I told her, "Why did you take it from me? I just washed it." The old people say if someone takes something woolen from you, they've taken your soul. My little girl was born. She lived for 5 months. Then she died. I saw it what killed her. First, in my sleep, but the little girl hadn't been born yet. My little girl was born. She lived for 5. Oh, that's repeated. That night, I found the child dead. I didn't see how she died. Something was grabbing at me. Grab, grab, grab. It pressed on me. I told myself it was a cat. Scat, I shouted, but there was nothing there. There was a match under my pillow. I struck it. There was nothing there. No cat, nothing. I couldn't sleep, so I got up to press some tobacco, a local industry. I went to the door. Wait, I said, I'd better check on my little girl. She hasn't woken me up all night. She hasn't been crying. When I uncovered her, she was dead. Well, it was a shade, a senka. This is the vampire that comes in the form of a shadow. It jumped from me to her. It felt so heavy, it was like I had 100 kilos on me. It was so heavy that when it leaped on the child, she couldn't defend herself. She was wrapped up a bit, swaddled, so it pressed on her a bit, the shade did, and she died in her sleep. Now, I hear a lot of pain in 40 years after the death of the child, as Danitsa is telling the story. She's still suffering from it. And so it's interesting that she blames the infant mortality on the monster, on the vampire. I'll say, and why I saved this for last, is that it's useful for her. The vampire actually is useful in the folk context, not just to tell stories about that are interesting, but it actually provides a measure of making sense of difficult things in the world. So we can see that the woman was a young mother and her husband was a soldier. So she was by herself, which would have been unusual for a woman, a peasant woman from Macedonia in 1954 or so. And moreover, she's been primed by a folk superstition that if you snatch a woolen blanket or something woolen, they've taken your soul, which is envisioned as a little lamb. So she's primed for something bad to happen. And then she has one of these clinical nightmare probably experiences, these sleep paralysis experiences at night when she's pregnant. She's primed for something bad to happen. And you can imagine she's got 5 months of relative peace where nothing bad happens. And then the unthinkable happens. What we would call a crib death, SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, probably. And if you're aware of how in American culture people go through this, the parents are devastated, but to make everything worse, it has been traditionally the case that first they're investigated as potential homicides, and then the society around them tends to blame them as the caretakers, saying, you should have been watching the baby, or you should have put the baby on the back, or you had it covered too tightly, or why weren't you paying attention? And they carry this guilt for the loss of their child that they don't have to bear. Danitsa has a monster. She at least, even though she feels grief still 40 years later, she at least has something that shows that it's an external evil being that killed her baby. She could not have done anything about it. Monsters, in fact, in human cultures are a traditional way of making sense of the inexplicable and the unexpected. They bring comfort because the unexplained event can be pegged without the responsibility of the victim. So here I would say, in a quote that I like very much by the British philosopher Roger Scruton, the consolation of imaginary things, though imaginary, is not imaginary consolation. Monsters are scary, but they also are ways of making sense of the world. So thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you so much. I learned a lot myself, and I was really pleased to be able to be here with you. I love thinking about how we as human beings have a need for beliefs. And if we think about the Slavic world with its religious structures that came in, and thinking about how those structures and the folk structures kind of together create this way to explain those things that do happen, right? Things that seem inexplicable and shouldn't happen. And at those particular portals too. I love, when we teach literature, we often talk about literary texts as a journey. You follow the hero's journey, for example. And here we have these portals of the birth and baptism, unmarried, and death, the places that we talk about as, being dangerous as you transition from one stage to another. And that's precisely where these vampires and evil folk come in. I want to go to some questions.
In fact, I
Yeah.
just follow with that.
Yeah.
One of the typical things in what are called fairy tales is that the young person goes into the wilderness. Vasilisa the Beautiful in the Russian fairy tale is driven out of her house and told to go get fire from the forest witch, Baba Yaga, who's a creature of particularly Russian, but similar beings are found elsewhere. Her stepmother fully expects Vasilisa to be gobbled up, because that's what happens to you if you disturb Baba Yaga typically. But she, for 3 days, because she's good, she does the duties, that carries out the chores, the tasks by which Baba Yaga is testing her, and she goes back. This kind of fairy tale scenario where you go into the slumbering forest and you're tested by a monstrous being and overcome it. Evil stepsisters, bad, wicked stepsisters do not. They get gobbled up or killed. But the good daughter will come back empowered for adulthood. So it's a journey, and the monster in that setting functions as an ordeal of a rite of passage, of the passage into adulthood. So sorry.
No, not at all. I wanted to turn to Sarah Wilkins' question, who wonders which of these spirits are similar to spirits in other cultures. Now that's, you could do a semester-long course on that, but maybe just a few examples.
I try to deal. It's difficult just talking about Slavic and Eastern European, because that's many cultures. In fact, I try to emphasize the particularity and the uniqueness of it. But yes, there are analogs in many cultures. Werewolves are not simply a Slavic thing. They're found throughout Europe. They were known in Roman and Greek, Latin and Greek mythology, and so forth. They're known in the Western Europe in the Middle Ages, and there are similar shape shifters in other cultures, many of them. The vampiric being, when you go into the internet, you'll see vampires from A to Z, and they'll say this is the vampire that you get in Malawi in Africa, and there's something in Amazonia in Brazil, and so forth. Generally, what I would say is quite interesting is you find that the vampire, if it's not simply a demon, if it's something that happens to a human after death, that often it is the case that these are particularly humans that have not been completed. They are forced to be destructive on the parasites on the human world, because they can't move on to their expected fate. There was a book written, a novel written by a Malaysian American novelist in the last couple of years called Ponti, and I can't remember the author's name, but Ponti is the name of the book, and this is based on the Malaysian idea of the Pontianak, which is a woman who has died in childbirth, and her soul cannot find rest, and so she goes around causing destruction to other pregnant women and babies, typically returning to the world that she left behind, the world, the part of the world that was most of concern to her. And so you find these demons that are human in origin that come back, what have been called in modern parlance undead in many cultures. The Mora, the demon that presses on you in the night, is one time I asked a Korean graduate student that I was who was writing a dissertation, do you have vampires in Korea? And he thought for a minute and he said, no, but we do have something like it. It comes in the night and it smothers you. And I said, it's like the Slavic Mora. This was known in New England and the Canadian maritime provinces as the old hag. And again, it's a real physiological experience that some people have. I have it, of the feeling of being suffocated as they're waking up, typically, or trying to wake up. And so the monster is logically, some people actually see it. I haven't had that. privilege,
Mhm.
but I put privilege in quotation marks. The students that I've asked who have said that they've seen something, typically just describe it as a female figure, they have no idea what it is. It's not an experience that gets talked about in the United States very much,
Mhm.
or not until the internet took it over. But they saw a vague, shadowy female figure with long hair. They couldn't see the face. This comes again and again and again. A dim female figure, and they see it pressing. So again, there are lots of cultures that have the demons that press in the night to explain that unpleasant sensation of sleep paralysis.
So here's a quick one from Mark Paprocki, whose name I'm going to pronounce in the Polish way. Are the Kikamora related to the Mora? And then we can move on to a couple other vampire questions.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's also a question that lots of people, lots of scholars have engaged with. The problem is the Kikamora, the Kikomora, is not actually a very clear figure, but in the lore that has it, there are lots of different variants, but the Mora part is actually the same word from the idea of the dead soul.
Yeah.
In this case, she's sometimes said to be the wife of the house spirit, or an invasive spirit that messes up women's spinning at night and makes noises. It's really hard to tell what she is, but the word is definitely connected with it.
So I want to combine two vampire questions, one from Will Hayduk and one from Rebecca Kartia, about whether vampires, is it part of Slavic vampire tradition that vampires can't enter a house without being invited? And Rebecca says, is it part of Slavic folklore that vampires drink blood? And if not, where did that originate from? So entering the house without being invited and drinking blood.
What Slavic peasant would, I talk about the peasants because these are tales that were told in the countryside by agrarian farmers, essentially. Who would invite a vampire into the house? It reminds me a little bit of the old the film Buffy the Vampire Slayer from 1994, where vampires try to come to a high school party, and they say, well, we have to let them in. They're seniors. But no, they don't want the vampire, and they don't invite the vampire in. That is something that I am aware of from 19th century English literature. It's very prominent in the novel Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, and in Dracula by Bram Stoker. But generally, a good peasant mother will barricade every conceivable entrance to with the sign of the cross before going to bed, to make sure that no evil being comes in. The vampire, however, can come in through the smallest chinks in the walls, or through the keyhole, and so forth, and they do so without invitation.
Which also helps us understand how vampires, among other things, are practical, that if you don't have any chinks in your house, it's better. Also, the mice can't get in that way. So if you take care of your house, then you'll be protecting yourself from all sorts of creatures, right?
Those mice, by the way, are also thought to be forms in which dead ancestors will occur. And thank you for the question, because it just occurred to me, of course, vampires don't need to be invited back into their own homes. They go back to their own homes.
Oh, right.
So all these years, I've never thought about it, but your question, thank you very much. I think that is relevant. Of course, they go to neighbors' houses as well. As for drinking blood, yes, vampires drink blood, and so-called living vampires, who are sorcerers that can send their souls out, will drink blood. And they do all kinds of things to kill people, however. They will smother them like the Mora does, or take their breath. In one Bulgarian tale, the vampire crawls up the nose of its victim. I don't think Edward Cullen would ever do that. But it seems very crude. And then they can do things like ring the church bells in northern Poland. Everyone that hears the bell ringing dies. That's a way of killing off the entire community. And very prominently during times of plague, starting the first story that I'm aware of here is in the 1340s through 60s. The vampire lies, they don't use the term vampire at that point, but she lies in her grave and chews on her shroud. And that kills anyone that has had contact with her. And this belief was known in Poland in the 19th centuries, and it immigrated to Ontario and was found among the Kashubian Canadians, the northern Polish Canadians that settled in the town of Vilno in Western Ontario, that the vampire rang bells and killed. So they can kill in different ways. And often, the vampire in at least in fairy tales, that is where you don't have people remembering what happened, but where you actually can have an active encounter with a vampire, they fight. So you can get in a fist fight with a vampire, usually not a winning proposition for you. The blood of the vampire gets swollen with your blood. So in various parts of the Slavic world, one of the things that you could do is take back your blood. You could eat from the dirt around the vampire's grave, which supposedly was suffused with blood, or you could take blood from the coffin. In Romanian lore, not Slavic, but Romanian, but closely affiliated, they would sterilize it, not I think for hygienic reasons, but they would burn it and then drink it in water. And the last incident that I'm aware of this happening was in 2005, where 5 men dug up a vampire who was a relative, of course, whom they thought was attacking them, and they gave the blood burnt to ashes to the people that were sick in order to try to heal them.
Did it work?
Yes.
No. Did. Okay. So I have we only have a couple minutes left here, so I want to combine some Christianity questions. One, John Pyle is asking about pre-Christian Slavic vampires and if they differ significantly. And actually we can combine that with Josh Garner's question about whether these creatures and monsters existed before Christianity and whether they were similar or different.
So this comes to a matter of reconstructing, because the earliest Slavic lore that we have was written by Christian monks.
Mm-hmm.
And they wrote the lore down because they wanted to disprove it so that people would practice the established religion. We can reconstruct. First of all, we know that it did exist because the word for vampire that I showed the map of, with the upir, vopir, upir, vampire, and so forth, it's all one word. And as a linguist, I would put that word existed at least in 400 AD, at least, in order for it to go to all of the different Slavic lands when the Slavs emigrated from their homeland, which was in Ukraine and southern Russia, along rivers there, east of the Carpathians. So when they emigrated to Poland and to the Balkans and so forth, they took the word with them. They already had the shared word. And many of the beliefs that you find in the most remote places, from the Baltic Sea up in northern Poland all the way down into the southern Balkans, you find the same beliefs keep cropping up. And so to my mind, I don't think that it was spread by travelers' tales. Sometimes beliefs are spread that way, but I think it's inherited. What does seem to be the case is that one of these monks that complains about people and their pagan superstitions says people made sacrifices to vampires, and that you really do not find in subsequent lore. That's something that seems to be prehistoric. They tried to buy the vampire off by making some kind of sacrifice to it so that it would placate the vampire and the vampire would not try to harm the family. So that is a pre-Christian belief that occurs in some texts. The pagan Slavs tended to cremate their dead, and so Christianity, when it came in, did not like cremation because the body was supposed to be resurrected in the flesh at the Last Judgment. So cremation became very difficult. And this actually seems to be one of the reasons why vampires become such a problem in Slavic folklore, because they can't totally destroy them by cremation as a preemptive strike anymore, because they can't cremate the dead.
All right, I'm going to
So we
ask
don't
one
know
last
a lot
question
about
here.
paganism, but okay.
Yeah. No, we have to round up. Thank you all for coming. I'm just going to quote from Shannon's comment here. She says it's fascinating, it's fascinating that a person tends to be at the greatest danger of becoming a tainted or dirty soul during times of transition and periods of vulnerability, feeling
Yes.
unfulfilled in life for one reason or another, and so becomes a destructive force. Kind of a parallel for things that can happen in the real lives of people, right?
An excellent observation. And one of the reasons why society has rites of passage, America is not a culture that necessarily takes rites very seriously, as the anthropologist Mary Douglas points out. But one of the reasons why rites are so important, or were in Eastern Europe, is because they were taken very seriously, and it conducted you from one stage to the other successfully, and showed, and all of the psychological baggage that's associated with changes, and it's real, right? The negativity and so forth is given ways of being expressed and expunged. So it's a great observation. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. And I think we will have to end there. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm sure that Dr. Collins would be happy to answer your questions if you want to zap him an email at some point, but his email box fills up quickly, what with the vampires who also write in all the time with their complaints. So if he doesn't get back to you immediately, you'll know why. Perhaps his box has been exploded like a skin full of blood.
Oh,
Thank you all so much. Thank you so much, Daniel. It was a delight to
thank you, Angel.
travel on this road with you. And as I think Alex has explained, the webinar will be available in some time. You'll get an email in a few days once it's all cleaned up and ready. And you should be feel free to share it. Feel free to come to any of our other events online or in person at the Slavic Department at Ohio State. We'd be delighted to spend more time with you. Thanks so much.